Hello, BookTube. All right, we're back for part 2 of my 7,000 Q&A. And we left off with Matthew L., so now we're moving on to Steve Watson, who asks, my question is, what makes a book worthwhile rereading? Which books have you reread most often? Well, I've reread Lord of the Rings, The Once Future King, Moby Dick, the Jungle Books, the Sherlock Holmes stories, the Mars novels, Edgar Rice Burroughs. I've Shakespeare. I've reread, but it's that's a completely idiosyncratic thing. I've reread those things because they hit just the right registers, and more importantly, they've kept hitting those registers every time I go back to them, which is the key to rereading. If you should reread, I think, on a regular basis, to chart your own progress as a reader and also to catch things that you missed the first few times. But rereading, the kind that I think is being referenced in this question, is the kind that is born out of love alone, just pure love, where you go back to a book and it still enchants you every bit as much as it did the first time or the 100th time. And that is going to be different for every person. That's going to be different for every reader. It's not a question of literary quality. That's going to be your own little menagerie of books that you reread compulsively, that you go back to recharge your reading batteries. It's going to be different for every person. I think it's incredibly valuable. I'd love to hear a large discussion on the books that people reread the most, the books that you reread even past the point where you need to. I can replay The Adventure of the Red-Headed League in my mind, word for word, paragraph by paragraph. There's no reason for me to take a book down and actually go through the page-turning motions of rereading that thing, and yet I do. I know every single part of Kaa's hunting in the Jungle Books, and yet I will reread when the reading itself is almost perfunctory. That is a totally different thing. I'd love to see a long discussion on that. That would be fascinating. Let's see here. Dimitar Stanev says, what are your thoughts on Maxim Gorky? I feel like when people talk about Russian authors, he is often overlooked. I agree. He is often overlooked. I don't quite know why. He belongs on the shelf of like the great 6 or 7 Russians, but he doesn't often come up in those conversations. I agree with that. I'd be curious to know. I'm trying to think the last time I heard Gorky even mentioned on BookTube. Much less examined. No Gorky read-alongs, no nothing like that. Joel Swagman says, I never read the 4 great Chinese classics, but have been debating adding them to my TBR. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, Journey to the West, Water Margin, and Dream of the Red Chamber. Have you ever read them? I have. In translation, in English. If so, what are your thoughts? Are they necessary reading for a Western person, or can they be skipped? Well, they're not necessary reading. There's no necessary reading. There's no wrong way to read. So they can be skipped. Anything can be skipped, but they're really good. they're really entertaining reading, and they give you a wide open door to a totally alien literary culture. That those two things alone are worth. I mean, can they be skipped? Is like there's some sort of, is this going to be on the exam or something like that? And that's not how this works. So you can skip them, of course, but I don't recommend that you do. I recommend that you find a really spirited English language translation and read them. Who knows if you might not love them. I love the Water Margin. Just love it. Let's see here. Joseph Coverley asks, I just wanted a Steve approval rating on some authors I've been reading. What are your thoughts on the following? Booth Tarkington, died owing me money. Ernest Poole, died owing me money. William Faulkner, oh, come now. Oh, come now. Read a tiny bit of Faulkner, a fraction of one abysmally awful novel, just to get a sense for what he does on the page. And then move on. And then move on. Your reading time is so precious. You sleep 15 hours a day. You don't waste any more of it than you absolutely have to on a charlatan like William Faulkner. And Thomas Mann. Okay, well, finally you mentioned somebody I can jump on a soap opera box about. Mann is great. All of it. The short stories, the novellas, the novels, the letters. Read everything. He's terrific. Just terrific. Easily in the running for the greatest 20th century writer of all. So, yeah. Read. Start with his huge books. They are immersive. They are wonderful, even in English. Let's see here. Jack Riley asks, what is your favorite Robert E. Howard story? Well, I'm going to be fairly easy here. I'm going to say probably The Tower of the Elephant. I know that it's on everybody's favorite list, but I think Howard just does everything right. I think there's a reason why it works on so many fans, because he just does everything right in that story. Everything that he can do well, he does well in that story. Number 2 is, what are the causes of your interest in President William Howard Taft? Well, I can give you one of the causes. An nice accessible cause would be his curious lack of ambition. We're so accustomed in American politics to having raving egomaniacs try to be and then become president. And Taft didn't want to become president. He wanted to be on the Supreme Court, and not for its power, but for its alignment with his own personal values, his own sense of the right and wrong of what's keeping society stitched together. I think that's incredibly rare. You can almost never find somebody by the time Taft was not wanting to be president, the American presidency was well on its way to becoming the most powerful position in the entire world. And he didn't want it. It was wrapped up on a platter and handed to him, and he didn't want it. And that makes him fascinating. Plus, I think he's fascinating personally on his own. Then question number 3 is, will the stature of the presidency recover from the Trump era? Well, I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer here, but I don't agree with the premise of the question. I don't believe the Trump era is going anywhere. So it's a hypothetical. I guess if you ask, could the presidency recover? It could. If you had an upstanding person, a happy family life, not a wife he bought in Eastern Europe who hates him, visibly hates him, not children he can't name. If you had an upstanding family person who was happy and well-adjusted and intelligent and respectful, you could do a lot on the world stage to recover the stature of the U.S. presidency. In a hypothetical, you could do that. But I don't believe the Trump era is going anywhere, so I don't think we're ever going to see that happen. And question number 4 is, your thoughts on the new incarnations of Star Trek. Would you like to see William Shatner reprise his role in the fashion of Patrick Stewart? Boy, you people have a knack for asking questions that could take us all night over wine and calzones here at Hyde Cottage. Someday you must all come here. Someday you must do that. Never mind hiring a banquet hall for Steve Con. Steve Con should happen here, with Frida frantically running from one person to the next to be petted and cooed over. She's not cooing with me today, because before I started this video, we did a little hair clipping. And that usually leads to her being sulky for quite some time, because she hates it. I don't know why. But she hates it. But she was starting to look like, as me sainted Ma would have said, she was starting to look like the wild man of Borneo. So I had to do something. But she'll warm up over time. But anyway, the new incarnations of Star Trek, I assume you mean Star Trek Discovery and Star Trek Picard. And it's radically different. Star Trek Discovery is awful. Just awful. It is what most of its vocal, neck-bearded critics describe it as. It's SJW. It's Social Justice Warrior Star Trek, where there's one main character, everybody else is an ancillary shadow of her, no one's as intelligent as she is, no one is as foresightful as she is, no one is as emotionally resonant as she is, no one is as tortured as she is, no one is as brave or as fierce as she is. She has a man's name and is multi-ethnic and she is just a Mary Sue, the classic old science fiction gimmick of a Mary Sue, of a new character who comes on and without any earned background outdoes everyone around her. And that term is actually very old. That is not a product of the anti-SJW wing of YouTube. That's actually an old term, years and decades ago, when Sandra Marshak and Myrna Culbreath, two of the original Star Trek fans, were putting out the word through fanzines and fan networks to send them original Star Trek stories so that they could maybe make an anthology. They had a brief list of rules for what the rules that those stories had to follow. No sadomasochism, because that was a very big thing in the informal Star Trek fan fiction that preceded their call. They wanted to just rule that out. No deaths of major characters. No major continuity changes. The Federation can't be conquered. That sort of thing. But one of the main things, and this was 50 years ago, that one of the main categories that they said was no Mary Sues. No new character who comes on and just unjustifiably outdoes all the old characters. It's a tired, lazy storytelling gimmick, and the writers of Star Trek Discovery did it with Michael Burnham. So it's not Star Trek Discovery, it's Star Trek Michael Burnham, and that is totally antithetical to the ensemble team group that Gene Roddenberry originally thought up. And at first, when I was watching Star Trek Picard, even from the title, I thought, oh no, this is going to be more of the same. This is going to be Star Trek Picard. It says it right there in the title. It's going to be focused on one person only. But no, Star Trek Picard rapidly becomes an ensemble drama. It clearly wants to be. I've only watched the first few episodes. I watched them at the old farmhouse up in Vermont with Mark Richardson, and we've both sort of made a kind of an informal pinky promise that we won't watch it anymore until we can watch it together. So it's a kind of thing that syrupy old Star Trek fans sometimes do. So, but the episodes that I saw were Jean-Luc Picard at 90, assembling an ensemble. And very consciously, that was the point of those episodes. They were also beautifully written, beautifully done. So I'm reserving judgment on Star Trek Picard. Star Trek Discovery is unsalvageable. Actually, it's not unsalvageable. It's not unsalvageable at all, of course. Romulans take over the starship. They board physically, and they are stalking their way from corridor to corridor, and at one point, maybe right before the second commercial break, they blow Michael Burnham out an airlock. Boom, Star Trek Discovery is rekindled. Because then the crew would have to band together to oust the Romulans and save the day, and there wouldn't be this Mary Sue character right in the center of it all. It's all political pandering. You don't get anything but inferior product if you do that, and I think Star Trek Discovery shows that. So my hopes are very tentatively ticking upward for the new Star Trek with Captain Pike and Number One and Ensign Spock and bright, optimistic worldviews and bright, optimistic camera angles and the USS effing Enterprise. I'm marginally optimistic for that. I'll report back. Nami Kisalita asks, how tall are you? In American measurements, I am 6'1". Anthony Suppa says, how do you feel about adapting works of canon into children's books? Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travels, Huckleberry Finn, Little Women are some examples of books that are especially susceptible to this. Do you see it as a good way of exposing your young children to literature or a distortion of the author's original vision? Well, of course it's a distortion of the author's original vision, because as you're rewriting the book. But I find them harmless. In fact, usually good. Anything that you can do to encourage anybody of any age to read, especially canonical classics that are so under fire in 2020, is good. It's been my experience that if you get a young kid, 6, 7, 8 years old, and they are precocious, they really like reading, and they want to do more reading, and you hand them one of these children's versions of Little Women or Huckleberry Finn, and you tell them that it's not the adult version, it's been my experience that they will only want to read the adult version. That's what they'll want to do, and that maybe they won't understand it all, but it's better to give it to them. Better to get them grappling with it early if they really want to, if they have the hunger. There's nothing worse, I think, for a kid than being told this book isn't for you. But then again, I'm not a teacher anymore, so these probably are godsend teachers. MNIKM asks, if it's not too personal, name an event or events in your life that's directly influenced the way you think about a great work of literature. As an alternative, pick a title that has revealed an entirely different layer as you matured as a reader. Well, the second one's easy. Lots of books do that. Where that's why I love rereading, because I'll go back and find whole things the author was doing and brooding over that I missed completely the first time. The first one, an event in my life that influenced the way I think about a great work of literature. I don't think my life works that way. It usually doesn't work that way, so no example is coming to mind. The second one happens all the time, where I will go back to a work, especially a canonical work, and just find a whole bunch of stuff that I missed in it. That's always wonderful. Humiliating, but wonderful. Malik Al-Rajab asks, question number 1, I find myself very picky as a reader. I would try something, give it a fair try, and if the prose, tempo, etc. were all aligned with my picky taste, I would devour it on the spot and go on to find my next discovery. This has caused me to sometimes DNF what is considered masterpieces. I also would need more time and attempts to find my next read. Is this normal? I often wonder how some readers enjoy almost everything they read and how they manage to be absorbed into whatever book they lay their hands on. Can I or should I fix this? Well, you should fix it. The kind of pickiness that you're describing is limiting. It's very, very limiting. You're missing out on a lot when you force every brand new work coming out from the infinitude of possibilities to squeeze through a narrow keyhole like that. You're hurting yourself. I mean, you're free to do it if you want, but it means that the vast, open, just infinite wonders of the reading world are largely going to be closed to you. So, I mean, the people that you describe who enjoy almost everything they read and manage to get absorbed into whatever they lay their hands on, you should keep in mind those two aren't the same thing. And I think it's probably unfair to say that they are. There are many, many readers out there who will become absorbed in whatever they lay their hands on. Yes, but that doesn't mean that they're saying that it's good. That doesn't mean they're enjoying it. It means that they're not picky. They're willing to take it in and figure out what they think about it. They're not just going to enjoy everything. I willingly believe that the number of readers who just blatantly and blandly enjoy everything is tiny. Tiny. Hi, Bean. How you doing? What you doing, baby? We're answering questions. We are. We're answering questions. Oh, you're not mad at me anymore. Oh, good. Good. I trimmed her hair just a little and she was mad at me, but now she's over it. Oh, I love you too, baby. Anyway, here's a second question. Any updates on your autobiography project? Oh my, I threatened to write an autobiography. I have for years. And I haven't, I'm not writing it at the moment, obviously. I would have told you if I were. But I've had several discreet pushes in that direction. Half a dozen people have been very insistent on pushing in that direction, saying I really want to read this book. So I'm seriously considering it. John Petter says, please drop us a few recommendations of books that made you laugh and give us your take on the differences between American and British humor, if any. I've never noticed a whole lot of these rumored differences between British and American humor. The books that make me laugh, I've mentioned many of them on this channel already, P.G. Wodehouse being a stereotypical example. But in terms of this alleged major difference between the two humors, I've never seen it. The books, I laugh just as much at... the only difference that I think is that it's rarer for Americans to do it. Americans in 2020 are so incredibly puritanical, so incredibly absorbed in proving their points and being serious and right and finding all sorts of things problematic and in need of cancellation, that humor has sort of exited quietly out the back door, whereas that is not true in the UK. So at least not anywhere near as bad that I've been able to determine, but not a fundamental difference, no. Clint Raimondo asks, any underrated fantasy authors? Quite a few. Yes, quite a few. I mentioned them in an earlier question about writers that I don't think get the attention that they deserve. Underrated fantasy authors there are a lot of them. People that wrote a lot. They wrote series, they wrote standalone books, and those books are wonderful. Lord Dunsany is one. Evangeline Walton is another. Jack Vance. There are titans that you will find in the table of contents of old science fiction and fantasy anthologies that you won't find in new science fiction and fantasy bookstore sections. And that's a shame. That's a terrible shame. They deserve a readership to continue. Alex Perez says, I wanted to ask about old translations and if they hold any literary merit. I'm a casual collector of antiquarian books and have several different translations of Horace, Ovid, Juvenal, and Montaigne from the 17th and 18th centuries that have been out of print for hundreds of years. Well, you've heard me mention on this channel in our Daily Penguin that translation is an art of its own. And yeah, a good translation will not only reflect the author being translated, but also beautifully reflect the prose of the time period in which the translation takes place. That can make them works of art on their own. So older translations, I love. A lot of them I love. A lot of them can be bad, but a lot of modern translations can be bad as well. A lot of older translations, I think, are works of art on their own. In an ideal, perfectly expanded Penguin Classic library, they would have their own editions. Let's see here. Tyler R. says, any good book recommendations on the Soviet economy? Any good books on communism more generally, perhaps ones with a positive spin? I don't know any books on... I don't know any books I would recommend on the Soviet economy. And boy, oh boy, have you come to the wrong channel if you want a positive spin on communism itself. If there are books that were written with such a spin, I have never read them. So I have none to recommend. Isaiah Armstrong asks, what do you think of John Steinbeck? Good writer or overrated? I think you describe it perfectly. He is a good writer who is drastically overrated. People go to especially his longer novels, but also Of Mice and Men, with a kind of quiet, church-like veneration that I don't think is warranted anywhere by what's on the page. He's good. He's a good writer who is badly, badly overrated, I think. Which is a real disservice for an author to do to an author, a real disservice. Let's see here. Bryce Fuqua, we're going to go in 30-minute intervals here. Okay, we're doing fine. Asks, are you a fan of Karl Barks's Donald Duck comic books? No. No, I'm not. They are comic books written for very small children. I don't see why they have any adult fans. And most of the people I have met in my life who have been adult fans and who have made some sort of claim as to their artistic merit were also just ravenous, rat-eyed collectors. They weren't normal people. They were very specific niche book collectors, niche comic book collectors. That made my skin crawl, frankly. So I'm not a fan of the books myself. I don't hate them. They're not. I'm also not a fan of wooden letter blocks that are made for tiny little preschool children. I'm not a fan of either one of those things. I'm not against them, but I've known people whose whole lives are determined by Karl Barks and a couple of other people, Donald Duck, Casper the Friendly Ghost, Richie Rich is a big one, Scrooge McDuck. I've known people at book conventions and whatnot that can talk about nothing else, can think about nothing else, and I also privately believe have dead bodies in their basement. So I'm a little leery of the whole subject. Rambling Raconteur says, you've mentioned going to all or almost all of the U.S. national parks. It's all, not almost all. Is there any that is a particular favorite of yours or that you feel is underrated? I don't know about underrated. Muir Woods is amazing. And it doesn't seem to me to get the kind of Foursquare attention that I think it deserves. Also, do you have a favorite national park outside of the U.S.? I know this is also predictable, but just in terms of sheer jaw-dropping wonder, it would probably be in Kenya, either the Masai Mara or Amboseli. It'd be one of the huge game preserves in one of the huge national parks in Kenya. They're just I've had many negative stories to tell of wandering around in both of those, especially the Masai Mara, but also wonderful stories as well. Just visual vistas that will stick with me for the rest of my life. John Gagarnarakis says, number 1, do you prefer Emerson or Thoreau? Emerson. What are your favorite pieces of writing from each of those authors? I love Emerson's essays. I know that's predictable. And I like Cape Cod by Thoreau. Number 2, what are your thoughts on the works of Nikos Kazantzakis? He is one of those authors that I read everything as it came out. I read all the reviews of everything that came out. I prayed in the back of my mind that no one would ask me to review something when it came out. And he's sort of just been... He was, for a long time, leveling along just in the middle distance there as an author that I knew was worthy and had lots of dedicated fans, but that had never done it for me, never really struck magic with me. And then in classic reader fashion, I met someone whose reading I respect, whose imagination I respect, who loves Kazantzakis, and that made all the difference. That now I am... That metric has changed. If the next time that I encounter a Kazantzakis novel for sale for $1, I will get it and I will read it with wide open perception. I love that. I love that when that happens. And question number 3, can you recommend a good book on climate change? I recommended one earlier in these questions, The Uninhabitable Earth, by, I think, Daniel Wallace Wells. Wallace Wells is his last name, hyphenated. It's a grim work, very grim. It's unrelenting in the picture that it paints of the future that we are facing, our children will be living in, and our grandchildren will be dying of. But still really important, I think. Richard Gribben asks, what I'm interested in is in bias, both in favor of and against an ideology. Liberalism, liberal conservatism, for example, and the inclination to fib, misrepresent, mislead, and play down, and perhaps even plain as day slander and slur, no doubt in order to discredit and marginalize. Business as usual in a competitive spirit, perhaps, but for a book reviewer it must be hard sometimes to adhere to the truth and thus remain objective and impartial. Are you ever tempted? Do you have some really least favorite authors in nonfiction or history? We are still human beings, after all. Well, okay, there's a lot to unpack here. We're all human beings is the type of phrase I most often hear used to excuse behavior that the person involved did not have to do, was in full enough control of themselves to avoid. And I don't like it as an excuse for that. Intentionally doing something that you know is wrong, and then saying, well, we're all only human, that's how humans get the reputation that they have. But in terms of the broader question of bias on the part of a reviewer, I think that's what the question is asking. Bias on the part of a reviewer. Am I ever tempted? Yes. Yes, of course I am. But there are writers, there are reviewers who do that. Usually you'll find them in political magazines that have the political screeds and opinion essays and whatnot at the front of the book, and then an art section in the back of the book that is sometimes nevertheless politically impinged. Usually you'll find them there, but there are reviewers that go everywhere. There are reviewers who are welcome at the TLS or at the New York Review of Books who are well known to have a penchant for dismissing the book in one sentence and then getting on their soapbox and ranting either against the author or against the author's worldview for 3,000 words. And the more you read in reviews, the more you will realize who those people are and to take what they write with a huge grain of salt, or just smile and wait for the inevitable backlash in the letters page when they mistreat a book. I have a fundamental difference from a lot of those reviewers because the purpose of my reviewing is you, not furthering a political agenda or an ideological agenda. So I falsifying what a book does well or poorly would be a fundamental betrayal of why I review books in the first place. So I'd like to hope that if I get a book, for instance, and I read it and I think, well, I just hate everything about this, but not critically. I couldn't be objective about this book. That does sometimes happen, and I just won't review the book. You'll never hear about it in a formal structure from me. DJC Silva says, hello, Steve. You have mentioned in an earlier video that your close encounters with various snakes, like rattlesnakes and Egyptian cobras. Could you please tell us a little more about that or other close encounters with wildlife during your travels? You name it. You name it, and I've had a close encounter with it. Snakes, scorpions, they're the worst. I've been bitten and stung by almost every kind of poisonous snake and scorpion that there is, even when I have been trying to avoid it. And it's just, when I traveled, I liked to travel on foot and well off the beaten track, well away from human checkpoints or human habitation of any kind. And if you travel like that, if you tread the pale flowers of Morgul Vale, then adventures you will have. And they did happen. Things like that happen. They're almost unavoidable. What nature areas, landscapes have made the deepest impression on you? One of the deepest impressions was the one place I went where nothing like that was even categorically possible. I don't think that's the reason. It's actually also incredibly beautiful, and that was interior in the Antarctic, where I struck out from the tiny little human encampment where I had originally stayed and went into the interior of the Antarctic where there be no snakes nor scorpions. And it was amazing. It's not a place that should be inhabited. It's so close to outer space. It's so close to being an alien world. You really feel it. You start to feel it there where you don't feel it anywhere else, even way, way down at the edge of South America. You really have to get inland in the worst place in the world to feel that. And also, P.S., who is your surly houseboy? I found him for sale. It was a blue light special at one of those big box stores years and years ago, and I've lost the warranty, so I'm stuck with him. Vaughntaseller asks, question, will we ever meet your surly houseboy? You will not. He thinks all of this is lame, so you will never see him on camera. Kojo Jojo has a number of questions. Number one, some advice to gain the ability to read around 50 pages of a standard book in an hour. Well, for me, I'd need to take a brick to the head to go down that low, but I understand what you mean. I know that you have an uncanny speed and appetite for reading, but the speed must be something that you practiced. And I remember you said in one of your videos that you skip phrases only on rereads. I struggle reading long books and hope I would marathon 10 books this month, but I have a full-time job from home, and the book was enormous. Okay, I don't know where you would have heard me say that I skip what I read. Even on rereads, I try not to skip anything. But in terms of reading faster, I think the gist of this first question is to read faster. There are a number of ways, and they boil down to practice. They boil down to practicing, getting yourself into a new kinds of habit and practicing that habit until it becomes regular. So the two things that most people do that slow their reading down. Number one is not dedicating time to reading. And you might say, well, but that's not true. I dedicate time to reading every day. But if your nearest and dearest all around you, the people that you live with, have not been explicitly told that this is what you're doing, they don't barge in on you when you're on the toilet. They know explicitly not to do that. If they don't know just as explicitly not to bother you when you're reading, and so they do bother you, then that's not time set aside for reading. If you are in a crowded place and crowded noises bother you, then that's not time set aside for reading. Most people don't do that. They say they set aside time for reading, but they don't really do that. I do, and that helps a lot. And the other thing that always retards reading speed is subvocalization, where you're reading the words silently as you look at them on the page or the screen, but you are sounding them out in your head, which yokes your reading speed to your speaking speed when they don't need to be. You don't need to subvocalize to read anything. That is undercut quite a bit by the incredible popularity of audiobooks that further wed the idea of reading to speaking. But it isn't necessary to do that. Those are two different parts of your brain. It's just a long habit that you're in. And you can get out of that habit. You can disincline yourself. You can break the connection between what you see and saying it in your head. And if you do that, your reading speed will double. You don't need to... reading things out loud, pronouncing them is much slower. Vocalizing is much slower than reading with just your eyes and your mind. As you will know, if on all the occasions when you have read without subvocalizing, if you're waiting eagerly for a particular letter in the mail on some subject, and it's only going to be a one-page form letter, and a lot depends on it, admission to college, approval of a loan, something like that, I guarantee you will not subvocalize that letter. And if you ever had a letter like that, remember how fast you absorbed it. It was lightning fast. And that's because you weren't subvocalizing. You can do it. It's just the ingredients on the back of a package, or the basic instructions for an electronic device. You don't subvocalize, though. You just inhale them straight from your eyes to your brain. And you can do that with everything you read. And you should, if you want to read faster. And then the second question, if you would create a character in a role-playing game, what class would you play? I would not do that. It's reading time that you're wasting when you do that. Question number 3, what do you eat most often for dinner or breakfast? I can't believe some of these things are of interest. Usually some sort of rice, spinach, maybe sliced apple. I tend not to have breakfast. I found that a huge meal first thing in the day tends to make me logy all through the afternoon, all through the morning, and I don't like that. I like to eat when I'm hungry. And for me, I don't know how it works with the rest of you, but for me, after a whole night of reading, first thing in the morning, I am not usually hungry, unless I'm in an unusual situation, unless my routines have been interrupted. But the routine that I have here, I usually don't eat until... usually it's after the day's long walk that I take with Frida. Usually by the time when that long walk is over, we come back, we're both hungry, and we eat at the same time. Question number 4, do you read articles from online papers or magazines? Do you tend to read what comes into email from different newsletters? What newsletters are you subscribed to? I'm not subscribed to any newsletters. I'm a sort of omnivore for collecting my news, although I've been very, very restrictive of that lately because it's so incredibly maddening. It's just so incredibly... It's not the same as any news atmosphere that I have ever seen in American history. So it is incredibly maddening because of that. So the President of the United States can go to a factory. Everyone around him is wearing a face mask. His own health administration has said wear a face mask. Everyone working in the factory is wearing a face mask. He's not wearing a face mask. He's filmed from when he gets out of the car. He greets people, smiles, laughs, pats shoulders, walks around, makes some comments about the manufacture of face masks, answers a few perfunctory questions from the press, and then gets back in the car and drives away. Every single second of that was filmed. The next day, the President of the United States is asked, why didn't you wear a face mask at that face mask plant? And he says, I did wear a face mask. It was just really quick and you didn't see it. And that is just... what is the good of reading about that? That is... I don't even know what to call it. It's beyond parody. It's beyond anything I've ever seen in American history, and that happens every day. So that some frothing at the mouth, Sieg-hailing Holocaust denier will make some weird, wild-eyed accusation on Twitter, and the President of the United States will retweet it. That happens every day now. So I'm severely limit my news intake. The periodicals that I get are all literary. The New York Review books, the London Review books, the TLS, that sort of thing. And I try to stick to the literary stuff. Sometimes in the New York Review books, I will skip the political essays just because they'll get me worked up for no reason. we are through the looking glass here in the United States. I've never seen anything like it before, and I don't understand it at all. I don't understand any part of it at all. All that I would be doing is getting myself worked up. When the President of the United States repeatedly refers, every time he has a press conference, repeatedly refers to the 1917 Spanish flu epidemic, when there was no such event. It was the 1918 flu epidemic, and no one corrects him. None of the people he's on the podium with, and also no reporters say, "Sir, you keep mentioning the 1917 flu epidemic. Such a thing never existed. Do you mean the 1918 flu epidemic? And if you do, will you start saying that instead of the wrong thing, which you have been repeating over and over again? There was no 1917 flu epidemic. Is there any chance you could correct that?" Even reporters who have nothing to lose don't say that. So I don't. See, I'm worked up already. Let's see here. And the fifth question: do you read any books by Matthias Enard? He wrote The Zone and The Compass. If yes, what did you think of him? I've read his English language translations. I don't know if that's all of his works. I wasn't overly impressed by them. Said Day. Oh no, we're over. We're at 30. All right, Said Day is going to start the next one. We're going to do 30-minute intervals here. I got lost with vituperation. I'll be right back. Thank you, BookTube.